All right, we are live with David Thacker, who is a partner at Greylock and also a former classmate. And we overlapped. We were both at Google at various points in our careers, but I'm so excited to have you on the program, David. How have you been, man?
I've been doing well. It's great to be here, Tom. Thanks for hosting me on the Fireside PM podcast.
It's so awesome. It's such a small podcast, but luckily, I've had the great luck of crossing paths with amazing people like yourself, and you're very gracious to give me your time. I know you're super busy. Why don't we start with just like a little bit of background about your kind of career journey, like how you got to where you are today, and then we can dig into some more specifics along the way.
Sure. Yeah, the abbreviated summary of my career, I grew up in Austin, Texas, before it was a discovered city. And went to college, studied computer science and economics. I was interested in always kind of tinkering with computers when I was a kid, and I was also interested in business. And then after graduation, ended up joining a startup back in Austin called Trilogy as a software engineer, and spent 4 years there during the internet bubble, which is an exciting time. My part of the company spun off and went public, and then ended up going back to business school, for a couple of years, with the idea that I wanted to get back into tech, but I wanted to transition into product management. And back then, this is the early 2000s. Most product managers at tech companies actually weren't technical. Most product managers had MBAs, because I think the early product management jobs in tech, especially in the internet, were kind of modeled after the traditional consumer packaged good companies and their product management job, where they would go and hire lots of MBAs. And so business school was the path to do that. And when I graduated, joined Google in 2003. It was one of the few companies hiring back then after the internet bubble had burst. But I spent 5 years at Google, great time there in a product management role, working on the core advertising system, AdWords. And then I spent 2 years in London building out the R&D teams in Europe. And then, after 5 years at Google, ended up leaving to join Greylock on the investment team as a venture capitalist. I wanted to try venture capital, although I thought I would likely end up back in a startup. And we had a bunch of great portfolio companies at Greylock back then. We still do, but ended up going to one of them called Groupon, which we invested in, which was a rocket ship, and was one of the first product managers there. And was tasked with owning all sort of the core algorithmic marketplace product experiences, personalization, things like that. And so that was a wild ride up and through an IPO. And then after a few years there, moved over to LinkedIn, which was another Greylock portfolio company, and spent 4 years there where I ran all the business products up until we got acquired by Microsoft. And then Google called about coming back. So I spent, then went back to Google, spent 3 years there as VP of product for all the Google Workspace products, which are the productivity products at Google, like Gmail and Calendar and Google Docs and Google Meet. And then Greylock called about coming back. So in summer 2020, I rejoined Greylock as a general partner, and I invest in early stage technology companies. So I've worked at a few places multiple times during my career, but yeah, bulk of my career, if you look at it, was spent in different product management roles.
Yeah, a lot of G's there. You got Google, Greylock, Groupon.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that transition back and forth between product management and venture capital. Did you see a lot of overlap, or was it more they complemented each other, but they're very different? Like, what were the similarities?
Yeah, there are very different jobs. But I think there are a number of similar skills and expertise that are required to be successful in either one. And Greylock, all venture capital firms are different. Greylock has a history. If you look at our investment team, I'd say most of our investors spent time in a product role, in a startup or a hypergrowth company, or have started a company. And so that's one of the things we look for when we're hiring people on an investment team. We think it's pretty important, just because when you look at especially early stage investing, but even now later stage investing, so much of whether a company will be successful or not is about the actual product, that they're building. The best products tend to win. And another important aspect is just, the founding team, the early technical team at a startup. If you've been a product manager at great companies throughout your career, I think you develop a really good sense for understanding, like, what does a great engineer look like? What does a great product manager look like? You're able to calibrate people really well, and so that's really helpful in evaluating early stage, teams and also the products that they're building. So at Greylock, we've tend to hire people out of the product background. Although I should say, if you look at the most successful venture capitalists, they have all different types of backgrounds. Like there's no one path, right? But for us, it's worked pretty well. The jobs themselves, to the second part of your question, like, are very different. I mean, being an operator and building products in a company is very different than the day-to-day venture capitalist. Venture capitalists, I spend most of my time every day researching, going to conferences, meeting prospective companies and investments, and then advising our existing investments or existing portfolio companies. But it can be very different day to day what you're actually working on. And a lot of the stuff you do as a venture capitalist doesn't actually, it can sometimes feel like you're not being productive, because, we'll meet with, probably this year, I'll probably meet with 200 companies, that are looking to raise money, and we may end up funding one or two of those, right? So you have a lot of meetings. Rising as a product manager, you're working closely with a core team and an engineering team, and you're building every day, and the things you're building today built upon the things you did yesterday and the week before and the month before, etc. So different types of jobs, but I've loved doing both of them.
What about when you transition from venture back into product? Do you think, were there any venture kind of experiences or skills that transferred into your roles as a product leader?
Definitely. I think a couple of the key things were just, as a venture capitalist, we spend all of our time obsessing about growth, right? And finding sort of unsolved problems and spotting opportunities which could lead to new companies. And then you're looking for companies that are early but growing very quickly because they've discovered something, right? And I think also as a venture capitalist, you're spending time with startups. You're thinking a lot more about monetization. You're thinking a lot more about distribution strategies and growth. The role of a startup, every early stage startup is just trying to break through the noise, right? There's so many startups that get funded every year, and so few actually break out and become successful, really successful. You're constantly experimenting and trying to find things like that. And a lot of that experience and those skills translate really well into product management, right? As a product manager, you're trying to figure out what are the unsolved problems where there's opportunities. How do you best solve that problem? How do you build something that's differentiated? And then how do you drive adoption, retention, and engagement, right? And it's on a different scale, but very similar. Which is why I think you look at early stage technology companies and startups. Most successful startups tend to be founded by people with product backgrounds, right? Product managers, because that's the way they think. That's where they have intuition, and but yeah, I think being a VC for a while made me a better product manager.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Are there things were there examples where you had to kind of unlearn things, like to be a great product leader, you had to be like, maybe some of the things that applied in the venture world, you had to kind of like, oh, well, I'm not in that role anymore. I gotta use a different playbook. Where there sort of counter examples?
There are. I think being a product manager at a bigger company, a more mature company, is very different than being a product manager at an early stage company. So, when you're at a company like a Google or a Meta or a Twitter, as a product manager, it's not just about going from 0 to 1. You need to think about, like, what are all there's a much more complex ecosystem in a company, right? There's implications for product choices that may ripple across the rest of a company's product portfolio, or may impact some customers or some users. And so, but the other thing is just that you have a lot of advantages as a bigger tech company. And so when you're building new products, you got to think about how to leverage those advantages, right? So an example is, if you're at Google and you have a new product idea, Google already has billions of users. And so you have an unfair advantage when you launch something new because you can get distribution very quickly, especially if you leverage existing products. Whereas a startup, you're always kind of thinking from scratch. So, in some ways there's huge benefits. Now, I think the other thing that's different, and I don't know if this is actually unlearning, but it kind of reinforced some learnings, is that in a startup, you have very scarce resources, right? And you're have to be extremely focused with what you're doing. Whereas in a bigger company as a product manager, you usually have more resources, you have a bit more of a luxury. And so I think, there's advantages to being able to leverage a lot more resources within a bigger tech companies, which just changes the nature of a product role. You're able to do more potentially right off the bat, whereas a startup, you've got to sequence things very carefully. But yeah, I would say there was more learnings from venture capital than sort of unlearnings moving back into a company.
And as a VC, when you're looking at founders with product backgrounds, I would imagine that you would highly value the product managers who had been in early stage startups before or founded them versus like PMs who've been at huge companies, because there are the types of problems that they're solving for the huge companies are, often very different than the 0 to 1 type stuff. Or how do you feel about different types of product managers?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I mean, at bigger companies, if you're a product manager, you're typically your scope and your span of responsibility is smaller, right, than if you were a CEO of a startup, where you're accountable for everything. And at a bigger company, you'll start to see lots of optimizations, right? A lot of product managers in optimization type roles. So going back to my Google experience, for instance, when I started Google in 2003, I think the product management team was maybe 20 people across the company. And there were probably 6 or 7 of us that were working on the advertising products for Google AdWords. If you fast forward today to Google, there's probably hundreds of product managers working on the advertising products, maybe even 1,000 plus, right? And so, but it's a gigantic business with hundreds of billions of revenue, right? So you can afford to start to specialize and optimize and put product managers on what seems like smaller problems, but will have outsized impact. Whereas if you're a startup, when you've got 10,000 users, you don't put people, and you wouldn't staff product managers on the smaller problems, because the impact is just a lot smaller, right? But as you scale, you start to build out these teams. So I think for coming back to your question around entrepreneurs, what makes the best type of founders, I think people that have only worked in really big tech companies before as product managers have a harder time starting something from scratch as a startup, because it's harder to figure out how to go to 0 to 1. Now, the converse, what I found as a product management leader, when I was at Google and LinkedIn, I love to have people on my team that were former founders. In fact, each of these companies, I acquired a few companies, right, and brought in founders and put them in key product roles, because founders can be very effective in bigger companies. A lot of times, those instincts around 0 to 1, the instincts on how to grow something can be very powerful when you apply it to a much bigger scale. And a lot of founders relish that opportunity. One of the reasons founders like to sell their startups to bigger tech companies, a lot of times it allows them to pursue their vision, but at a much bigger scale across a lot more users. And then the last part is, founders tend to question everything, and don't necessarily like to bureaucracy or hierarchy or stuff like that.
Right.
And so if you've done correctly, that can actually be healthy for a bigger organization to bring in some of that entrepreneurial talent to help shake things up. It can also backfire sometimes, but I've seen it been mostly a positive.
And how did you help those founders adjust to the scale and process and kind of structure that, often these bigger companies had that they didn't have to encounter when they were running the whole show? Was that ever area of support that you would provide to these founders that join your team?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would. Well, first of all, I would. They don't like to be micromanaged. So no one likes to be micromanaged, but especially not entrepreneurial founders. And so I would treat them more like I was a member of their board of directors, the chairman of their board, and they were the CEO. So giving them a lot of autonomy, and then clearing roadblocks for them, right? When they run into organizational resistance, helping them when it makes sense, push through that and clear those roadblocks and giving them air cover to do that. I think is really important to help entrepreneurs, thrive, and then just making sure they get the resources they need, to execute on their vision.
Let's talk a little bit. We've talked about that transition since it's such an interesting kind of, it feels like you've got these two skill sets and have jumped back and forth. You're a little ambidextrous in that way. But let's talk a little bit about your product career, leading, as a VP of product at places like Google and LinkedIn and Groupon. Like those are big product jobs. What do you think contributed to you getting those opportunities? And like when you think back about what made you effective as a PM leader?
Yeah, I think when I reflect back on it, I think, part of it is, I think when you start out a career in product management, it's really just about, being able to execute really effectively, right? So with whatever product task you're given, and typically when you come in as an entry-level PM, your new manager or your new org will advise you on what they want you to work on and what you want to do. I think it's just really, doing that extremely well. And I always say there's three things I look for in product managers that I think make great product managers. The first is an ability to set a vision, right, for an area. And that's where you're basically articulating what the future looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it can be on any time scale, but I think like a perfectly reasonable time scale is like a 3-year time scale. Like, what does this product look like if done correctly? What could be the impact? And being able to articulate that. So being an effective communicator of that vision, to the team that you're working on, to upper management, to the people that might be reporting to you. But I think that's like a really important skill. The second skill I would say is super important is project management expertise. So the ability to take that vision, translate into a roadmap, and then get a team to execute so that you actually deliver what you say you will, and it will have impact, and you'll iterate. And that's really important. And I found, there's a lot of product managers that are great at articulating the vision, but they stumble and they can't get it executed, right? And then you're not very effective if you can't do that. The third thing I would say, the third skill I would cite, for being a great product manager is just raw leadership, and the ability to influence others. And you look at most product managers, they're not managing the engineers, they're not managing the UX designers, they're not managing the cross-functional team, but they have to, and they're fighting for scarce resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have to be able to influence other people, other organizations, and this is the raw leadership, to do what you need them to do to make sure a product's successful. So, during my career, I just tried to work on all those three things, and they become even more important as you scale in your career, right? It's just maybe the number of products you're responsible for, the number of people scales, but you still need to be able to set that vision. You still need to be able to make sure the team can execute, and you still need to be able to provide that leadership across the organization. And I think, product managers are, the best definition I have is like, they're the people that will make things happen in companies that otherwise wouldn't happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most successful product managers have really pushed through controversial changes that may have been controversial internally, it may have been controversial externally with users and customers, but they helped build out the product and build out the company. And you can think of any of the big companies. There's lots of examples of where companies had certain inflection points, and a lot of those were just driven by great PMs.
You talked about vision and storytelling a little bit. What advice do you have for PMs out there that want to kind of hone their skills around setting that vision and bringing people along and getting folks excited about it? What have you seen work well in terms of best practices or kind of key capabilities around that area?
Yeah, I think it's, sometimes, people have in their mind, well, you need to be some really charismatic leader, right? That can stand up in front of a crowd of thousands and, inspire people to
In the
action.
turtleneck.
Yeah. Steve Jobs, right? And by the way, Steve Jobs, everything he did, and if you've studied him as a speaker and as a presenter, was very carefully scripted. And I've heard stories where he would practice for weeks on end, spend hours and hours preparing for a 30-minute keynote or a 1-hour keynote, right? So that it was just everything was perfect about it. So it seems so natural that he's able to do that, but really it's like all the preparation that goes into it. But I think for a PM, if you want to communicate a vision, my recommendations are a couple things. One, always start with the problem you're solving. That's sort of first principles, right? And that's super important. Two, I would keep things as simple as possible. I think very smart people you'll find in product roles at tech companies will tend to overcomplicate things, right? Because they want to be very thorough in the way they describe something. But simple is usually better because people have the more dense something is or verbose something is, you're more likely to lose people. So I think starting with that the problem is sort of the first principles, being very simple in the way you communicate what you're doing and concise is very important. And then I think the written form, the narrative is really important. And so the companies I've worked at, I've encouraged, like for when we're doing product strategy discussions or product reviews, is for teams to create one-pagers of their product, a one-page document, no more than one page, that basically describes what you're doing, why it's important, the problem it's solving, the impact and benefit to the users, and maybe other attributes of the product. And then you can use that to socialize this. I think a written document is much better than a slide deck or a slide presentation, because slide decks is harder to tell that narrative and story, whereas in a written document you can. And then of course, the last thing that really helps with vision around a product is any user-facing product, being able to show just mock-ups or screenshots of what you're doing. Like that can go a long way in illustrating what people are doing. So that's my recommendation. I always encourage teams, hey, create a one-page document on what this product is, where it's going, why it's important, and show us some screenshots of what it's going to look like, which help people get an idea in their mind of what a product could be.
Yeah. And when in your experience as a PM, when you think back about who you learned the trade from and some of the key kind of influencers for your development as a product leader, what comes to mind? Are there particular people who you learned a lot from or saw modeling kind of the type of product leader you wanted to become, or were there like some crucible experiences that helped make you the product leader that you became?
Yeah, I think for in terms of developing your leadership skills and developing yourself as a leader, I think one of the most important things you can be doing is observing other leaders, right, in your organization or even sometimes outside your organization, and seeing what you think they do well, what they don't do so well, or what you don't like about it, and then coming up with a composite picture of what you think a great leader is, and then sort of modeling your leadership style after those examples, right? I think everybody has to come up with their own leadership style, for product management. And but yeah, if you have the opportunity to work with a lot of great people, you can start to model sort of the best things and take learnings from all different people. But I think back in my career as a product leader, when I joined Google in 2003, I worked for someone named Salar Kamangar, who was one of the early employees at Google. He's not very visible outside of Google, but he's kind of the unsung hero. I mean, he played a lot of great roles within Google, including I think he wrote the original business plan for Google, but really drove AdWords, the initial advertising business. He went over, and managed all of Google's application products like Gmail and Calendar. He was, after Google bought YouTube, he was inserted to run YouTube, which turns out has become one of the best tech acquisitions of all time. And so definitely learned quite a bit from him. And there were other great product leaders at Google, Susan Wojcicki, Sundar, Marissa Meyer, Richard Holden, Deep Nishar. There's just a lot of great folks. And then at LinkedIn, I think both Reid Hoffman, the co-founder, and Jeff Weiner, the CEO, really great product-oriented leaders. At Groupon, I worked with Jeff Holden, who had been an early Amazon employee, had run consumer at Amazon. He's one of the best I've ever seen at starting vision for product areas. And so, there's been, a number of folks that in my career I have had opportunity to work with, and each one of these people, I picked up bits and pieces of things that I applied to my own style.
So you talked about Jeff being really good at setting vision. What was it that made him like what was so special about how he set vision versus all the other folks that you've seen do it?
He has a lot of charisma. He has a lot of energy. He's wicked smart. But I think the best thing is like he sees the future, right? He's always thinking 5-10 years ahead. And so he can very clearly and simply come up with, with sort of a vision for the product that people can rally behind, right? Where you say, wow, yeah, it makes sense. Things are going to go this way, right? And so I think that, again, coming back to like how is PM and venture capital similar? Being able to see the future is helpful. Like if you have a great idea in your mind, a picture of where things are going and what product experiences look like in the future, it's an incredible advantage. And it's kind of funny. I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities in, you think about science fiction as a type of genre of literature. Great science fiction writers are predicting the future. And if you go back and look at science fiction novels, or even science fiction in the movies or TV, get Star Trek from the 1960s or 70s, some of the things that they were predicting would happen have actually come true, right? And so I think the best product managers have that same sort of skill where you can see where things are going.
You mentioned Salar a few times. What were some things that you learned from him that you thought he was amazing at?
Yeah, I think in terms of focus, prioritization, understanding where the opportunities were within products, all very key. He was incredibly effective working with technical teams and engineering teams. And if you've met him, he's not a huge personality, but was a very effective leader. And I think the other thing that I saw him do a few times is he was very first principled in his thinking in terms of doing what's best for the users. And so I saw him launch some products and push through some product changes that were not necessarily popular internally or externally, right, with other constituents of Google, but they were the right things to do. And it, after you launch some of these product things, it turned out that the user benefit, the growth was clear, result of those decisions.
When you think about your own product career, what were some of the toughest challenges that you encountered?
I think there were a few things. I think early on in your career, I think one of the hardest things is how do you and this may be unique to Google's culture. I think there are some company cultures where a product manager is really the anointed leader, and whatever they come up with, whatever they say to do, engineers will kind of get an order and just do that, right?
Oh my God!
Will just come together. As companies like Google, and Google hires incredible engineering talent, world-class engineering talent, which is one of the reasons the company's been so successful. There's a lot of engineers at Google, especially when I started in the early days, that didn't think product managers were necessary, right? They didn't want to work with product managers. That's probably still the case today. And so as a product manager, you had to earn the trust of the technical teams and help them understand, how you could be really valuable to the team and to the products. So so I think that was definitely a learning, and I think I've always throughout my career since Google, and this is where I learned this, I've always treated my engineering counterparts, my user experience counterparts, as equals and
Mm-hmm.
co-owners of anything that we're building. And I love it when engineering leaders and UX leaders have very strong ideas and suggestions for the product, right? Because I think that means they care. It can make it harder to move fast because there could be a lot of healthy debates.
Mm-hmm.
You have to, eventually, earn trust and things like that. But I think it makes for a much better team dynamic. So that's one example as an early product manager. So I would encourage every product manager, like, your most important relationship is your engineering teams and the engineering leader you're working with, the tech lead. So really invest in that. And then the second thing I would say, a key learning, just as I scaled in my career, I think the best product managers, coming back when I talked about, being able to execute really well and having great project management skills, you need to be in the details of your product, right? It's super important to really understand how things work, and that includes technology architecture. It includes, doing lots of user research, looking at the data, but really understanding, the market space you're operating in. But as you scale in your career and you manage bigger and bigger product teams, it's harder to stay in the details. So I think there's two tactics. If you're a VP of product, your tendency is to want to be in the details of everything. But in my last role at Google, I think I had 20 different products I was responsible for. So it was just impossible to be in the details for everything. And it's much better, rather than being at the surface level of every product, it's much better to basically focus your time and attention as a leader on whatever needs you the most at that given time, or it could be day or week or hour of the day. And you shouldn't be afraid to totally disrupt your schedule and just focus on the most important things. And this could be an example where, it could be a product that's going well, project launch, so like really focusing your time there. It could be something where there's a crisis related to your product. You had an outage, like, freeing up your time and focusing there. Or a really common situation is where teams are disagreeing. You have teams that aren't agreeing on a path forward, and so as a leader, you should dive in and help them figure that out and make a decision so that teams get unblocked and can move forward. So that's sort of the learning as a leader is don't try to stay in the details of everything. Just focus your time and attention on where you can add the most value.
When you think back, David, a lot of us learn from the areas where maybe we didn't succeed as much as we wanted, and it was a struggle. Were some of your biggest product struggles? Do any come to mind where you're like, wow, yeah, that was a huge learning experience, and it kind of impacted how I led later afterwards, and you look back and think of it as like a key inflection point in your career?
Yeah, there's been a number along the way. I mean, I've certainly been involved in many product initiatives that did not work or did not go well. And what I've tried with all of those things is to take away learnings, right? I think product management's an iterative process, right? So even if and the same thing is true of startups, even if something doesn't go as expected, if you can learn from that and then use whatever information, whatever the data or the qualitative analysis or user research, to basically inform the next iteration of the product, the next product experience, like that's incredibly important. I think, I was, I'm trying to think of some good examples. I mean, more recently at Google, we had a number of things where, we launched products and they didn't work out, and we actually had to shut them down over time. And so Google, one of the products I inherited when I was there was the Inbox product, which was for those that aren't familiar with it, it was an attempt by the Gmail team at Google to reinvent email. And so it was thought to be a better way to organize the email experience, or it was called Inbox. And it was really geared towards power users of email who strive for zero inbox in the way that they categorize and label things in their inbox and their folders. That was the idea, like very opinionated point of view of how it should work. Well, Gmail had 2 billion users at the time, and only about 5 million of them were using the inbox experience. And there were a number of users that loved it, right? But it just never got mass adoption because the learning there is like very hard to change people's behavior, right? And sometimes you have a particular point of view on how people should use a product, how they should use email to be more productive, but people just don't want to do it, and so we ended up shutting down the product, which was really hard. But when your core product has billions of users and you've only got a small percentage using sort of this new experience, we had to admit, this isn't the right approach. Let's give up on this to free up the resources. And there were a lot of, there was some technical architecture and things like that, improvements that were developed for inbox that we were able to inherit with Gmail, right? So not everything was lost. But one of the key takeaways for me there was, you should really always optimize for the default experience of your product. And I think what sometimes happens is you have a set of power users that really want to work a certain way, and there's a risk, if for just like over optimizing for a very small percentage of users. Now, sometimes that's necessary because those users could be really valuable in some dimension, from like a monetization dimension or some other way, but it's not a good use of resources. Like you want to be spending your resources on optimizing the experience that the vast majority of your users are using the product that way, right? And so that was a lesson from Inbox. When you've got 5 million users using it this way, it's better to optimize for the other 2 billion users that are using the core experience.
Yeah, that's super interesting in that I've heard the flip side argued as well, where some people say, oh, design for the power user, or like there's this story of like the OXO kind of like home appliances where I'm told were originally designed for like really elderly people with arthritis, but then it turns out to be like a great product for everybody else. Do you it sounds like when your position is no, you design for the default user because you don't want to end up kind of over optimizing for these kind of edge cases. Do you see any argument on the other side, or do you find that less persuasive, I guess?
Yeah, no, I think I'll give you an example from LinkedIn. If you looked at LinkedIn, um, early on in LinkedIn, it was very clear, LinkedIn didn't have a lot of great user engagement in the early days. People would come and set up a LinkedIn profile, but they really wouldn't come back to the site that much. It might be if they were looking for a job, they'd be very
Right.
active on LinkedIn. But we did notice that recruiters were intense users of LinkedIn, right? They were, if you look at they were less than 1% of the users on LinkedIn, but in terms of the engagement, like a disproportionate amount of engagement. And what were they doing? Well, LinkedIn's an invaluable tool if you're a recruiter looking to hire someone, because you can basically browse a resume of or a database of not just resumes. I mean, LinkedIn profiles are much more dynamic than resumes. They're much more up to date. And so LinkedIn, we ended up building a tool called Recruiter that was a separate product experience looking into LinkedIn's data, but it was designed specifically for recruiters. And that product became LinkedIn's first $1 billion product, right? So we didn't optimize the default experience on LinkedIn for recruiters, which could have been a temptation because they were the most active, engaged power users at the time. Instead, we said let's create a separate product experience for them, because if you would optimize the default experience, there's a chance you would have turned off, the average user, which is having those average users on the platform, the non-recruiters, is why the recruiters come to the platform. They're trying to find all those users. So I think you have to be really careful with optimizing for those power users. And in some cases it may make sense to create a separate experience for them. Again, and you'd only do that if a certain percentage of a small percentage of those users is supremely valuable from a monetization potential, or from maybe there's some growth vector there.
Right.
Is the reason you'd prioritize that.
Yeah, that reminds me of my YouTube days where, we have a separate creator experience, but there were debates where it's like, oh, well, why don't you just have all the creator workflows embedded into the main app, the main YouTube experience? And, there was definitely trade-offs to doing that. you couldn't build as kind of intentional and opinionated experience as you could for creators if you put that in front of all the viewers, because they'd be like, well, what is all this stuff?
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that's why, I mean, a learning from Google and from LinkedIn is like, the best products tend to be very simple and easy to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Under the hood, they may be very complex, but you kind of extract all that complexity from the user, at least from the average user. And, I think, Google, the core search results page is probably the shining example of that. It's very simple.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was very contrarian because, most internet companies like, Yahoo and Excite and others had these very busy internet portal pages. They just threw lots of stuff on there, whereas Google stayed very, very simple. And I remember, I think it was Marissa Mayer at Google who ran, was an early Google product leader and was responsible for the UX of the core Google experience. She had a rule that if users weren't, if at least 10% of the users weren't using a certain feature, it shouldn't be in the product, or at least it
Wow.
shouldn't be like, fully exposed in front and center. I believe she came up with that, but it really forces, I think it's a good rule of thumb. It forces simplicity, right? And it forces sort of optimizing for this default experience. And sometimes there's, you can, without providing lots of features and controls and knobs for users, you can still give them a great experience that's personalized by inferring, or collecting various explicit and implicit signals and playing that back to users without users having to be exposed to that complexity.
Yeah, it's definitely much harder to design a simple product than to just add a million buttons and drop downs to it. I would be remiss, David, if we didn't talk a little bit about the current kind of startup venture environment. Like, it's a weird time. We're recording this now, November 11th, 2022. The economy is kind of in a weird place. What's your what's your vantage point? What's your take on how the economy is doing, and what does it look like for entrepreneurs out there?
Yeah, the economy is certainly deteriorating. I think because of low interest rates and the pandemic, a combination of those things. I mean, we had an unprecedented amount of funding going into startups. We had probably an unprecedented number of startups, that were getting founded, and then a lot of startups, because of the pandemic, saw massive accelerations in their business, right, due to changes in consumer and business behavior. So, the economy runs in cycles. I started my career during the internet bubble, so I've seen several cycles now, both the internet bubble popping and then the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And this feels like it will be of similar magnitude. So I'm not sure we've seen the worst of it yet, unfortunately. So that's kind of all the bad news. But things tend to correct the downside as much as they were on the upside. What that means for startups is, there's still venture capitalists funding companies. We're funding companies. But the bar has definitely gone up for, what it takes to raise a seed round or a Series A round or a growth round. And, for startups themselves, the bad news is it's a lot tougher to raise money in this environment, right? And it can be tougher to grow in this environment because consumers' behavior is changing, businesses' behavior is changing. The flip side of that is, there's it can be a great time to build a company, these economic downturns, to build a startup, because, it's easier to hire talent. It's easier to get office space. There's not as many venture funded competitors. You have to be much more disciplined in the way you grow, which is hard at the time, but in retrospect is a great thing because it forces you to be really focused and clear on your value prop and your business model and things like that. And so when the economy does eventually come back, which it will, and this could be a down cycle, we could be in an economic downturn now or a recession for a year, 2 years, hopefully not longer than that. But when things come back, I think the best companies will grow stronger through this and will be well positioned. But there will be, startups that will go out of business. And there will be down rounds and things like that, which are not popular in the startup world, and we haven't seen that in a long time. But the secular trends that are driving innovation and technology adoption are just as strong as they've ever been. And so when you look back around at the economic downturns of the past, whether it was after the internet bubble burst or in the great financial crisis, like great companies were founded and grew during those time periods. I mean, Google was founded right before the internet bubble burst, but really just powered through it and emerged much stronger. When you look at the time period 2009, 2010, there were companies like Uber, Airbnb, Square, Twitter, that were all started during that time frame, like really iconic companies. So, our encouragement is for startups or for founders is like, it can be a great time to start a company now. You just have to be really disciplined in the way you run your business and focused, which, by the way, that's always great advice, to be disciplined and focused. Even in boom times, companies should still be disciplined and focused. But now it is really important because your ability to survive as a company totally depends on that. But yeah, it's going to be tough times, right? And it's hard to see all the layoffs. So many companies overhired over the last few years. So big companies laying off people and downsizing, right-sizing their companies, like that's going to continue. And so it's a tough market, but the best companies, if they can survive this, will be really well positioned for the future.
Have you seen an uptick in founders reaching out to you who are formerly at these well-regarded or tech companies that have been, laid off and think, well, maybe now's the time to go off on my own? Have you seen any of those folks show up, and what advice do you have for them, to start a company in this environment? Clearly they have to be disciplined and focused, but it seems like it would be a long commitment from them. It's not like they might be at a small stage for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, we're still seeing a lot of people starting companies, a lot of founders coming out of the bigger tech companies, not necessarily ones that have been laid off, but people are coming out starting companies. I mean, the advice for founders that want to start a company, whether you've been laid off or not, like you should be really committed to what you're doing, right? Like, I mean, that sounds obvious, but startup journeys are hard. They can take 5-10 years. And so you should be really excited about what you want to work on, and you want to work on it for a long period of time. A lot of founders, they want to devote their life or a big chunk of their life to whatever it is that they're starting their company. And sometimes it's a mission or a problem that they personally can relate to because they have domain experience in that area, or maybe there's a personal reason they want to pursue that path. And then the other thing is just make sure you're starting a company, if you have co-founders, which I think is usually a good thing, making sure that you're really excited to work with the people you're founding the company with. But we're still seeing people want to start companies. It's interesting, the types of companies people want to start changes or can change. So I'm seeing less interest in crypto and Web3 startups. I mean, there's still founders starting in that space, but that's not the top area as it was a year ago. And by the way, sometimes it pays to be contrarian. So when no one's starting crypto companies in a crypto winter, it could be the best time to start a crypto company, right? So yeah, you got to factor all these things in. But I coming back to it, I think this is a good time to start a company.
So you talked at the beginning of the interview around about you might meet 200 companies and write one check a year, or every 200. What are the common characteristics of the lucky one out of 200?
We look for a number of things when making investment decisions. I mean, the founding team is, especially the early stage, is paramount. The idea they have, and for the idea, the space that they're going after, typically for us, what I'm looking for is, do they have some insight, especially some unique insight on why so many startups don't work because they took the wrong approach, or they misjudged something, or they had the wrong timing. They were too early or they were too late. So usually you're looking for like, is there some really great, unique insight that this company has? I get really excited about missions of companies, like, what are they trying to accomplish? And and the founders, do they have a really good fit with that mission? We call it founder market fit. Like, how relevant is that founder and their experience and skills to starting a company in this space? And then for companies that may have built a product or a prototype, we evaluate the technology and the product to see, like, is this something that's really, solving problems in a new and unique way? And remember, for startups to kind of break through the noise, typically you can't just be 10 or 20% better than existing solutions. You've got to be 5 to 10x better than existing solutions. But what I've always found is that it's a confluence of those things, but there's no science to decide which check to write. And especially for early stage, there's a lot of intuition that goes along with it, right? So do you think that a massive company can be created by these people in this space? Is one of the questions we ask.
And what do you do as a VC when you take a meeting and your last check was like 50 companies ago, but you're like, wow, I think this one's really the one? Do you say, oh shoot, I need to see a minimum of 100 before I start getting the check out?
No, it's kind of funny. I mean, I think as a VC, it's just, you have to have patience, but these things are very unpredictable. I mean, I've had, investments where in the span of like 3 weeks, I've seen those 3 companies and made 3 investments, and then you could have 9 months where you don't make any investments. So there's no particular pattern to it. It's totally random distribution. But yeah, I think patience is key as well, because as a new VC, it's very easy. I mean, everything looks great and exciting, right? But you have to remember that most companies, especially early stage startups, will not ultimately be billion-dollar plus companies, and so so it's trying to find those ones that you think can be.
We're almost out of time. I'd love to ask you about a recent investment you've made where you can share a little bit about what was the unique insight that kind of got you excited, and what's that company doing? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think the most recent company that I have announced the investment in, I have a few that haven't been announced yet, but was a company called Amplify MD. It was an early stage startup. We led the seed round. It's in the healthcare space. And what the company does, very talented founding team. I had worked with one of the co-founders previously at LinkedIn, but they decided to create a telehealth platform and network of medical specialists to serve patients in hospitals. And the founders are very mission driven. They want to improve access to great medical care. And the problem they're solving is that, most hospitals in the United States don't have access to medical specialists like cardiologists, hematologists, pulmonologists, et cetera. They don't have those people on staff. And so when a patient comes in and needs to see a specialist like that, you may have to transfer that patient to a different medical facility that could be 100 miles away, right? To make sure they get the right medical care, or they just don't see a specialist. And so this is very common in urban hospitals, a lot of rural hospitals. And so with the advent of telemedicine and the ability to do things through video conference, they built a platform where you can, for hospitals, where a doctor in a hospital or a nurse can order a consult with a telespecialist, and they do it via Zoom, and they transfer all the medical data electronically. And they have this network of medical specialists on call, sort of like an Uber for medical specialists,
Right.
where a doctor in a hospital can just order one, and they'll be right there. And that specialist could be anywhere, right? In a neighboring state or somewhere else. But it's amazing. The hospitals love it because it allows them to treat their patients more effectively. And you see improved patient outcomes, and then it also lets them keep those patients in their hospitals, which there's a business benefit to that. So again, the unique insight here was, hey, with the pandemic and with the advent of great video conferencing systems and all these electronic healthcare record systems, patient record systems have APIs and things. We can actually build a platform here that can facilitate all this. And the timing was perfect because COVID really mainstreamed the adoption of telemedicine.
Yeah.
And now doctors are comfortable working that way. Patients are comfortable with it. Hospitals are comfortable with it. Insurers are comfortable with it. So that was the most recent investment, and really great tech, really great founding team, unique insight. We think the timing's right, and then just a really purposeful mission that has a big impact on these patients, being treated through the platform.
Checked all the boxes. Love it. Well, David, it's been a pleasure reconnecting, and thank you so much for sharing all of these insights and advice. And folks who are watching this on replay, let us know in the comments below, what you thought was the most useful advice that you got from David. And if you have any other questions, maybe we can get him back on the podcast in the future. But with that, I'm going to thank you again, David. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great to be a guest on the podcast, and have a great weekend.
You do the same. Take care, buddy. Bye.